So hello everybody to this webinar, the concluding panel on last year's topic we had on democratic trends in a global age of digital disruption, lessons from African smart governance. We are CASP, the Center for African Smart Public Value Governance. And if you haven't joined us yet, a quick presentation about ourselves. So my name is Emam Foim. I'm based at the University of Bern. And with us today is Adila Kodabux, who will take over the discussion just after myself. She's based in Mauritius. And unfortunately, Amar Seam, who is based at Glasgow University, can't be here today, but he's sending many regards also from his side. So we would like to address a topic that is quite urgent. We think it became recently urgent, particularly throughout the last year, when we think about the many movements we have seen across the globe, but also particularly in Africa, a kind of a wave of democratization, but also drawbacks again. And what we also realized is the role of digitalization of social media that, for example, the Gen Z refers to in order to initiate these movements. So although we hope and think that this topic is quite timely, actually, we thought about it a couple of years ago when we thought to think what shall we do for last year's activities in order to address our overall themes of CASP. Quick introduction about CASP, the Center for African Smart Public Value Governance. So as already mentioned, we are a partnership from scholars who are based in Mauritius, but also in Switzerland and now also Scotland. We started actually our thoughts about it in late 2020, so in the midst of the pandemic, when we realized the role of the state and particularly also of the bureaucracies, and we had the impression we would like to do more research, empirical research about African ways of bureaucratization of how public management works. So we, on the one hand side, we have a practical aim to contribute to discussions on improving the quality of public governance in Africa, but then we also have a theoretical aim by refining theory development in public management and organization studies from a non-Western perspective. With this aim in mind, we have conducted several events, webinars, but also workshops, on-sites and conferences and so on, as you can see here on our slide. And what we also tried to do each time was to address a research debate in that mind. And we also, Adila, you can switch to the next slide. We tried to come up with some outcomes, with some research outcomes. Here, a brief summary as, for example, when we thought about, after our inaugural series, when we thought about what could be a research agenda for African smart public value governance, where we summarized the insights from our inaugural webinar series. We also trying to engage more in empirical work, really collecting data on how public organizations in African contexts work, as we did in our publication in 2024. And we have an ongoing work also that we could just present this year, early this year, in the Africa Academy of Management. Nice side note, it was also awarded as a best paper in TAC 3 on public policy and administration. For this event series, which started in 2025, so last year, we actually thought, let's do a bit a different approach and let's reach out actually to scholars who work in Africa or about Africa and hear about their opinions and about their thoughts of what it means to do, what it means democratization in the age of digital disruption in the context of Africa. So we had this call, it was still in 2024, and we selected then 3 opinion pieces we thought they're particularly interesting to look at this topic from different perspectives. We had the first one in May, where we talked about the role of Meta, Facebook, in the context of democratization and digitalization. Then we had the second one already in June, presented about the role of data protection. And finally, we had a final webinar in October where we also look particular on the role of bureaucracies, of e-government issues that are related to democratization and digitalization. In each webinar, we had one discussant, which was the first one, Nick Cheeseman, Joseph Asunka, and then in the last one, it was Chipo Tendere. They are here also today with us, and they formed a panel which will allow us to have an overall view about the three opinion pieces, to see how do they relate with each other, what is different, what are different perspectives that's touched upon. So to have a broader debate about this overall topic, we wanted to start in last year's opinion piece discussion. So this is the introduction for about CASP and what we have done so far. I'm handing over to you, Adila, to introduce particularly today's panel.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mamdin. I think you were breaking a little when you were speaking. I didn't want to interrupt. So in case I'm breaking on my side, maybe it was on my side, let me know. Hopefully it's working, okay? Hopefully everyone can hear me. So yes, thank you, Mamdin, for the introduction to about the work that we do at CASP and a little bit about our events. And also, yes, mentioning the excellent news that the paper that we collaborated on with our partners from last year's stakeholders resulted in a Best Paper Award. So it's a really good achievement that we wanted to share with everyone. We hope that the manuscript as well gets published where it is currently being reviewed, and we will share in due course about the work that we do. So yes, it's a very interesting topic that we are having about lessons from African countries about smart governance, and we are addressing the idea of digital disruptions. Digital disruptions, which is happening globally. And we have invited opinion pieces from our authors, and they have written on different pieces. And we have three different themes today that we want to briefly summarize. And from our perspective, from our view at CASP as well, we would just like to provide a brief commentary as well from our perspective, what it means and how it also can connect to the work that we do. And yes, along with the authors of opinion pieces and along with our panel discussants, we want to brainstorm further about the topic, and eventually, perhaps beyond the webinar today, we would like to think about possibly a common sort of public output that we can have as well from the discussion. So the very first piece by Haruna and Idris was about how Meta's decision will cripple local journalism, and according to them, embolden foreign propaganda in sub-Saharan African countries. For them, they view digital disruption in terms of what it means that you have a fact-checking system ending. More precisely, Meta ending a fact-checking system. And we have looked at what it means by Meta replacing professional third-party fact-checking, how it raises concerns about misinformation and propaganda spread in sub-Saharan African countries. Previously, according to their work, they found that Meta actually used to support fact-checking system, and according to them, that being stopped would impact on the spread of misinformation. And of course, we address the implications on local journalism. They focus on examples in Nigeria. And they also mention the dual role that is played by social media. As a news source for many Africans, but also the negative impact of social media as well, and as a threat to local journalism. And for them, the link local journalism and the implications of social media, the absence of fact-checking system, they link that to democratic governance. According to their work as well, or their opinion pieces, the consequences of fact-checking withdrawal, according to them, would be a continuing spread of foreign propaganda, and they focus on Chinese and Russian propaganda spreading as a result of a withdrawal of fact-checking. There was very interesting there was very interesting and constructive feedback provided by Nick as well to help them improve opinion piece and to address the topic from a multifaceted perspective as well, which we agree as well at our within our work at CASP, in the sense that, of course, when we think about global disruptions and their implications, we cannot overlook the dimension of media, social media, and the impact on local dimensions, on local facets as well. We at our work at CAS, we also like to draw on distinct case studies as well, to look at examples where we can find where African countries are actually showing instances of agency, adapting or adjusting according to circumstances, or addressing grand challenges according to ways that work for them. Of course, that requires perhaps more in-depth analysis and case studies. And one case study, of course, doesn't mean generalization, doesn't mean that it would apply universally elsewhere. But we also would like to draw attention on, yes, in the age of digital disruption as well, there are some traditions as well, or some existing work happening within local journalism that cannot be overlooked. One of our actually, I have a particular piece that was published 2 years ago. It was about the use of humor by local journalists in order for them to translate world news and make it make sense for local audiences. Yes, it enhances understanding of foreign news, and it's about making use of humor as well in order to address foreign propaganda, foreign aspects of news, and so on. My point here is there are examples that they were particularly on the work of political cartoonists. And yes, political cartoonists as well, they tend to be targeted, they tend to be threatened among other journalists as well, for when they are a news source, and when they are critiquing local government or foreign governments and so on. But the point here is, yes, in the age of global disruption, we have to acknowledge the ideas around spread of misinformation, but we also should not overlook the aspect of agency locally, and how local newspapers as well are surviving in a very, very complex world, competition driven, and also where we face a lot of threats and intimidation. But there are examples as well that we should not overlook, and there are examples like The Continent, which is a very important news source about African context, which has really adapted and worked according to, it's shared freely, you subscribe, and it's a very important source of information, increasingly becoming so. So these are examples that we should not overlook, and it links to the discussion that we are having. Moving on to the second opinion piece, there were overlapping discussions, but a really completely different theme, in the sense that Lydia, Astrid, and Thomas, they actually looked at data collection under the EUDR, standing for the European Union Deforestation Regulation. Really, really interesting opinion piece. And they talk about harmonizing transparency and data protection for environmental democracy. And for them, digital disruption, they viewed it in the sense of the EUDR's implications for data protection, data handling of supply chains of African countries. They actually talk about third-party countries, particularly focusing on African context. They address data protection challenges while they acknowledge, the EUDR acknowledges the GDPR. According to their work, it does not address data handling in countries that, according to them, lack adequate data protection. According to their work, approximately 84% of EUDR relevant imports come from countries without adequate data protection, which thus expose these countries to data misuse by intermediaries. And potential data misuse means manipulation of data for non-compliant products and selling data to unauthorized entities. Overall, in their very interesting opinion piece, they argue that actually there are opportunities for harmonizing digital technologies, digital solutions for African countries with the European Union. So they propose actually three type of recommendations on the short term, medium term, and long term. And in terms of short term, they argue for supporting digital solutions, such as being able to trace data information and allowing for data certification. Medium-term recommendations, according to their work, is to restrict access to create more strict access rules for data and adherence to minimum data collection standards. And long-term, according to their work, is to establish and enforce national data protection laws to guide data handling and transfers. So we had a very interesting second opinion piece as well, which was about data protection. And they looked at digital disruption here in terms of laws and regulations. So that was another interesting food for thought as well, because when we look at European Union-driven regulations such as the GDPR, I believe 2017 or 2016, this is where it was starting to become more implemented, about 10 years ago now. And at that time, even for me as well, as someone in an African country, I needed to learn about the EU's GDPR, because if there were data that I was handling as a researcher, and if I was connected with a European Union counterpart, I needed to follow European Union rules rather than local data protection aspects, which were still budding in comparison with the GDPR. So it's some food for thought as well, that initially the GDPR being seen as some sort of obstacle. But then when we identify that there are actually gaps as well in terms of local African context, and here what it means for locally data being exploited or being misused, when perhaps there is that lack of harmonization that they talk about in their opinion piece. So I thought that was very interesting. And from our perspective at CASP as well, this is something that we would like to dig further as well, alongside with Lydia, Astrid, and Thomas. And moving on to the final opinion piece that we've had, it was by Valentina. And here she talked about governance in the digital era in Africa. And for her, digital disruption was in terms of, I hope you can still hear me, it was in terms of digital technologies and what digital technologies mean for public administration in African countries. They have to adapt to technology. And yes, there are two sides that were presented in terms of it being able to enhance governance in terms of service delivery, in terms of socio-political engagement when it comes to election times and so on, or more widely, socio-economic development. Of course, in her work as well, she addresses digital divide and digital divide persisting according to geographic disparities. And there are different access to resources. different access to infrastructures, and there are challenges as well, such as low digital literacy, budget deficits, and so on. So digital technologies here being what would be causing some sort of adjustment needed to address grand challenges, being what represent digital disruption. And there are opportunities and there are examples that she provided, including from Rwanda and South Africa. So for us as well, for our work at CASP, this was another interesting piece. And it also connects to an ongoing and existing work that we have done at CASP, in the sense of smart developments that are happening. Specific case study that we looked at was the implementation of the metro system in Mauritius, being something that was implemented to help with addressing environment, being more smart in terms of transport and so on. And here we tried as well to look at what made the implementation of a smart transport system effective locally, and how public administration as well had to adjust and adapt to a new form of technology and the challenges it represented for those who were a little bit adverse to the implementation of the transport system back at some years ago when it was trying to be implemented. And here we had to be mindful of the multicultural dimension of the Mauritian context as well, that actually they adapted in order to unify around the project of a smart transport system. So public administration as well is something that we look at a little bit more in depth in our work at CASP. And we also try to look at distinct examples as well that are bringing new insights that are perhaps distinct from the mainstream discussions that we have about democratic trends and digital transformations, which generally tend to be around elections, voting, media, which is, of course, very much needed conversations that we need to continue. But there are other aspects as well that we have to not overlook. So which is why we were very keen on having this opinion pieces, this call for opinion pieces, and to have ideas from different themes that were generated from the authors. So again, it's a lot of ideas that we have gathered. We are not coming up with one thesis, one conclusion. Rather, that's the idea of a conversation that we enjoy having during our webinar series. It's part of a conversational thinking in order to help us create new ideas and to think further about what we can learn from each other's work, how we can work together from a theoretical perspective, and of course, eventually, how we can connect more closely with the work of people working practically in the field, be it public practitioners, journalists, or more stakeholders. So we tried to sort of summarize it in key 3 themes, and we saw that, of course, there was a key focus on media. And here there was the implication on local journalism, their relevance, and their need for adaptation as well to digital disruptions. Of course, it's an abstract summary that we are offering, and which we should not overlook. Second theme as well that we considered was very important was about laws and regulations. And we didn't want to keep this one too broad. We wanted to be specific because it was a really interesting piece by Lydia Thomas and Astrid, about data laws and data protection and what it means from an African context as well. It also pushed me as well to look at some of the indicators about African democratic governance that are actually addressing data privacy. Some of them are directly, or some of them are indirectly, such as we are looking at ease of access to information. That would be around data privacy and so on. Others would have it more directly. There's one by the Ibrahim Index for African Governance, which directly addresses data protection and so on in African countries. And it's very interesting word, a choice of word as well, that we have seen in the work of Lydia. It's the word of harmonization, because it brings us to the idea of guidelines and regulations, especially when they are coming from non-African countries, and whether actually they are being imposed, or actually could there be means for harmonization between local contexts and over regional contexts. So the choice of word harmonization, we found that really interesting and something to think about in the discussions that we are having about global digital disruptions, smart democratic governance, and so on. And the third theme as well about public administration, we are continuing to have this discussion about incorporating digital technologies. It's been ongoing. We are not reinventing the wheel here. It is happening. But how is it happening? Is it happening too slow? Or it's actually not happening at all? Or is it happening only in the matters of talking about e-voting or converting paperwork that used to be hard copies into PDFs? Is that digital transformation? What is it smart about it? There are actually examples that we want to continue looking at and to reflect on the topic of smart governance. So the public administration as well is something not to be overlooked. So these are three key themes that we have tried to summarize, and we have enjoyed reading the pieces from our authors and also the key contributions from our discussants as well, how we can improve each of our own work, some constructive ideas, and perhaps some much more food for thought as well that can connect to the work that we do. And on that note, that brings me to now the panel conversation that we would like to engage in with Nick, Joseph, and Chipo. And we have some guiding questions in mind, but we don't want to restrict this discussion to only these ones. We would really be interested in having your perspectives about from the work that you do as academics or as, the director of Afrobarometer. How can you, there are a lot of examples of African countries where there are positive transformations happening. So can we think of examples of African countries that are taking the lead in promoting smart governance? I would like to lead with this question and start with that one. And if it connects to any other of our discussions, we can have that. But let's focus on the first question at the moment. There's no order of how to go about it. Anyone of our three panelists who would like to start, feel free. Otherwise, I'll pick a name.
Sure. So the last panel, I guess, but first of all, thank you, Adela. Thank you, everybody at C4SP for your work on this. And it's been fun to engage over the year and learn a lot. I was going to say that the last presentation where we discussed, I believe it was Namibia, I have been very impressed where right now, in this moment, we're thinking about the internet shutdown in Uganda again ahead of tomorrow's election, right? And that is one of the more extreme examples of how the government can violate rights and diminish citizens' ability to participate using digital technology. And on the other hand, we have Namibia, which has made wonderful strides on almost every spectrum. And I was looking it up, like you can use digital technology for healthcare, you use it for transportation, all of these things that they've done. And I think what we can learn from Namibia is that the interconnectedness, right? So often people talk about digital technology or the internet in separate spheres. But the example from Namibia is that when you do it right, and when you're able to get people online and for them to have access and easy access, right, in almost every sphere of their lives, then it makes governance easier. If people are able to register for their licenses online, renew their passports online, register for medical bills, register students to attend school. If all of that can be done, then that's one effective way of promoting good governance in all other areas, right? And so you cannot separate out smart governance and just say, oh, we're going to focus just on the political aspects of digital governance. You can't do that. But that's what I wanted to sort of jump in with.
Maybe
Thank you,
just to
Chipo.
build on Chipo. It's always dangerous going after Chipo because she's always so eloquent. But maybe just to build on that. I mean, I think one other point we could make is that obviously, we know that some countries have had a head start on the digital technology side and on the smart governance side. Places like Kenya are known for being innovative in some of these areas. And I've seen some really interesting work. I had a brilliant student do a dissertation this year on, healthcare provision and using digital services to enable Kenyan users to understand what healthcare providers were in their area and then to find the cost of those and to select lower cost options and so on. So there's really interesting work that's going on there. I think one of the things that we need to say is that, the challenge is always that the technology doesn't solve everything, right? The technology doesn't solve challenges where the problem is political will, such as corruption. It doesn't solve problems where there's limited infrastructure and no provision. And it doesn't solve issues where government budgets are being cut because of limited tax revenues. And of course, these are all issues that are playing out in Kenya at the same time as the development of increasingly smart services and digital governance. So I think, it's interesting. You can see in some areas where there's been a real attempt to use systems, for example, digitization of procurement records as a way of introducing smart government and promoting transparency. And then the idea being that through that you get control over corruption in state procurement, which is of course one of the big areas of concern. But of course, as we know, political leaders are very clever and very smart and often able to find ways around this. So even if you now have to be more transparent and put all your documents online, you can still find a shell company in Dubai or somewhere and create a fake set of beneficial ownership documents and relationships that enable you to hide what you're really doing. And then you can put those informations into the smart system that makes it harder for those on the outside to actually have real transparency and accountability. So I think we are seeing some really exciting, innovative, developments, but I think we need to see that balanced on the other side with an increase in state capacity and the sort of traditional political developments, right? The other thing, just to flag, and then I'll hand over to Chipo or Joe, anyone else who wants to come in, is that, of course, one of the things that makes us a little bit nervous about some of the smart governance stuff, and it's starting to come out, I think, in popular discussions in Kenya, is that, of course, the more digital data governments have and the more they can surveil their publics. And, we don't want to be conspiratorial about it, but we know that one of the big increases, I would say, over the last 5 years, this connects us to the final question you have there, which is question number 4. One of the big trends has been an increased capacity for governments to surveil their citizens, in some cases using technology imported from outside the continent. And so one of the things that I think we also need to think a little bit about is there a risk that some of the data generated through smart governance and other systems could end up being used to surveil and control populations. We're not necessarily there yet, but given the advances that we're seeing and given the way that technology is being utilized, I think that's a sort of interesting concern for the future. So one of the questions I would sort of have for some of the authors who've written about this and maybe some of the people in the audience is, how do you balance those two things? How do you drive forward smart governance and generate the benefits and efficiencies of that while safeguarding against this? And one of the things I've started to see people really mobilizing around is, for example, passing data protection legislation and passing citizen information protection legislation in parliaments to actually make sure that citizens have rights over their data and over their information. Some countries have done really well on that, but a lot of countries, it's a big legislative gap, which of course leaves people, particularly vulnerable to the abuse. So just a couple of thoughts from me, and just echo Chipo's comments earlier. Really great to be here, and thank you very much for inviting us to be part of this excellent panel.
Yes, I'll jump in here quickly, and thanks Nick and Chipo for your insightful comments, and the team there. I think their opinion pieces were really, the one I reviewed was particularly very interesting. So thank you for that. I think, for several countries, and as Nick and Chipo has pointed out, digital disruptions is going to continue to be a double-edged sword. It's going to empower citizens. It's going to empower, governments as well, and the empowerment comes hand in hand. So the ways in which the state is empowered with technology, citizens are also going to be empowered in that way. And we can see that, of course, the efforts at mobilization to be able to mobilize citizens for advocacy or citizen engagement in any fora or in any platforms, it's much easier now. The barrier to mobilization is much lower because technology is advanced. And of course, some of the protests that we've seen that has happened is all through, social media mobilization, which makes it very easy for even one influencer to create a whole movement by themselves. And so that kind of citizen empowerment is very helpful. And if you're talking of examples of where the countries that have been, innovative in some of these digital innovations, what Kenya is already mentioned here, of course, Mauritius or South Africa, we know that e-governance has become a big thing. My own country, Ghana, has become, increasingly digital, such that some of the services, government services, can easily be done online, at least until some point where you need to visit an office in person and complete final processes. And so I think this is just going to increase over time. But we need to be mindful that the double-edged sword nature of this digital disruption is going to be with us. Like, you can't do away with it, because the more it empowers citizens, the more it empowers the state for, as Nick pointed out, surveillance. It empowers the state to be able to control citizens in some way. And so trying to deal with that double-edged sword, which is almost going to be inevitable. The thing is that, if it empowers citizens in ways that citizens can actually leverage technology for advancement, of course, but there's also a risk there, because the more it empowers citizens, the risk of influencer politicians can be very powerful, because you can have one person as an influencer who can almost circumvent political parties, because political parties can become useless if they are not up to speed with technology. And if there's one person or a couple of people who are really influential in the political train, they can drive a lot of support and movement around them. And they can become the real power brokers as opposed to political parties. And so I think the benefit of technology is huge, but also the risks of it, because of the different pockets of powers it can create within an economy, that we need to be very mindful of. And dealing with that is going to take a lot of thinking and effort. And as I would agree with Nick, it doesn't really just eliminate corruption overnight. It won't happen until there's that political commitment to want to really root out corruption.
Thank you. And sorry, Chipo, go ahead. Yes.
Well, I was going to say, I think, one of the early mistakes as the internet was becoming a big part of African life was that we erroneously, and when I say we, I mean academics, right? We erroneously assumed that the internet would be the tool for pro-democracy actors only, right? There was this like, this is the world, the point where the internet leads to democratization. But as both Joe and Nick pointed out, is that the emperor is not sleeping. The emperor now has the tools for the internet, and the emperor is quite committed to unleash those tools. And I was thinking about Kenya because I read a piece where they were saying that African data, so citizens' data, is the new oil. That's a bit dramatic, but the whole point is that selling citizens' data is enriches countries, right? And how do citizens protect themselves from this if we are struggling to do that in more developed societies? How do we engage with AI? I was just watching a video from some officials in Uganda where they've got all these videos of Uganda is open, everything is nice, and you look, it's like, this is AI, right? But these are the things that they're using to trend. In Zimbabwe, thinking about digital economy, they just introduced a 15% tax on all transactions that are done online. 15%, in addition to another 15% that already existed, right? So now using the internet, because they know that people are engaging in online activities, and that 15% tax is for everything that you do online, including paying for Netflix, right? So whatever you pay for Netflix somewhere else, add almost 30% there. And all of this in the guise of we want to digitize the economy. We want to be able to extract revenue from the digital economy.
Thank you. And these are key insights. And just to go back to the point that Joseph just made, it's about the different pockets of power. And actually, a very interesting point about political parties, they can become obsolete if they are not adjusting to digital technologies in order to survive politically and so on. The point here is, in terms of digital disruption, who are the ones that are going to be left behind, and who will be the ones leveraging the digital technologies, and who will be making the most of it at the expense of others. It depends on financial power. It depends on power in the general sense as well. And yeah, it relates to the trend of autocratization or democratization. And, you know, the balance and the double-edged sword as well that you are offering as insights are key food for thought as well. And we can keep it to the questions that we have here. I just would like to have a look at the chat box as well. Imamdin, in case I've missed any question, feel free, anyone who would like to raise their question and to mention it should have.
Yeah,
okay, thank you for the feedback. Yeah, go ahead, Imamdin.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions, and yeah, maybe let's jump into them. So let's start with the first one with Wangari Kamau. You're stating, does public administration cover enforcement and regulation of digital platforms, or is it that distinctive form incorporating digital technologies in governance efforts? Maybe you want to quickly summarize your question, or anybody who among the panel would like to address it?
Yeah, so I don't mind clarifying my question. I mean it from the perspective that Africa is considered to be a frontier for these digital platforms. For example, with multinational private companies, let's talk about maybe the social media platforms and whatnot. Africa is a new place for them to be able to expand their offerings into. So in asking that question, I was meaning, does it only consider how the government utilizes technologies, but do we also consider it from the other perspective of how the government is receiving these new technologies?
Yeah, I think
Yes,
when
Joseph.
it comes to this, when it comes to these issues, especially for regulation, I do think that's one of the biggest challenges we're going to encounter, because the regulations that you will have in place for multinational corporations that run these platforms, some of these, operations actually operate outside of the legal system of the different countries. And the question becomes, how do you regulate something that is so international and so global? And this is where multinational cooperation and global cooperation is important. It's unfortunate that in this day and era, especially the past year, issues about global cooperation, international cooperation has become fraught because the US is almost stepping away from different multilateral cooperation. But I think the most effective way to deal with the regulation of these global technology giants is more about international cooperation. I'm glad that at least the African Union has taken on this drive of smart Africa, thinking about ways in which there can be cooperation around the development of infrastructure to facilitate technology advancement and digital innovations. But then that comes with the fact of thinking about ways in which regulation of some of these provisions, whether it's the technology companies or the providers of technology services, are regulated, should be elevated beyond the country level to the national and the continental level, because you need to have regulations in ways that Togo does not have to sit with Meta to negotiate or have some regulations, and then Mauritius will do it, and South Africa. If there was a continental platform that allows for some level of regulation that come from as a continental platform where regulation is developed at that level and companies or providers of technology services are regulated at a certain level. Of course, there are certain things that will be done at the national level, but we do need a higher level of regulation that allows for this kind of engagement with technology companies that operate outside the legal systems of different countries.
Thank you. And that can link to the question that we have as well. What is the future outlook in terms of digital disruption? So in terms of a top continental level initiatives, and then that would be coming up with some guidelines and regulations, and then the implications for local context. So that's something we can connect to one of the questions we had. And there's also another question from Majda. Her question is, she wonders, Majda wonders whether the digitalization of governance is turning into a tool of differentiation, separation, and social exclusion, where access to public services becomes dependent on citizens' ability to purchase a phone or tablet. Yes, Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just want to say thanks for all the great comments and questions everyone putting into the chat. Well done. Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I was going to come in on this a little bit earlier because I think you mentioned something along the same lines. And I was really struck a few years ago by a briefing that I think Michael Braddon wrote for African Affairs, where he was looking at how mobile phones were used in different places. And one thing came out of that. The data's a little bit out of date now, but the point remains that, we tend to assume, because we know that in Kenya technology is so pervasive and so effective, that everybody has a smartphone, right? A lot of people sort of get to that assumption very quickly now. But there's a lot of countries where 30% of the population still don't have a smartphone, 40%. There's a lot of countries where 20% of people still don't have great reception or reception that will allow them to use the internet effectively. So we need to keep in mind that, there are going to be winners and losers from this. And certainly there have been big controversies in Kenya, for example, when the government wanted to start moving a lot of the payments only online and to remove other forms of payment. There was a big backlash. And one of the reasons for the backlash was that a lot of people are going to struggle to be able to pay in that way. So I think that's a really good point that we need to keep in mind. The other point that we really need to keep in mind, I should say that I think a lot of this research was done using Afrobarometer data. So it's a cue to go to the Afrobarometer for great data on this. One of the other points that Mike made in that piece was about the fact that a lot of people were using mobile phones in very distinctive ways. So people, some of the data tells us, for example, that people, and I think some of this data comes from the mobile phone companies, that there were some people who were only using it for voice notes. And the reason they're only using it for voice notes is that they're illiterate, right? And so they can't text, or they might be able to text, but text in a different kind of way. And so one of the things we need to think about, right, is that, your ability to fully use the internet and to fully use online resources partly depends in most platforms on how literate you are. And we still have some countries where 20-30% of the population is functionally illiterate. So again, all of those issues around kind of will this actually overcome or will it actually reinforce existing inequalities, I think are really good ones. And one of the things that it would be really great to see governments doing more of, and I think some have done some work on this, is, how do we fill those gaps? How do we fill those gaps in terms of technology? How do we fill those gaps in terms of coverage, in terms of signals? And then how do we make sure that everybody has the digital skills and the literacy skills to get online? The continent, to be fair, we hear a lot of doom and gloom about Africa, but this is one area where there has been tremendous investment, in the sense that if you think about what happened in the 1990s, a lot of countries moved to free primary education. So in some countries, there's a lot more children going to primary school than there was before, but that's not always universal, and that's not in all countries. And as we know, poor levels of investment in countries, like in Zimbabwe, which Chipo can speak to, which used to have a very proud education system that has been progressively run down under this government. Those, unless you keep up your investment in education, you're not empowering citizens to fully use the digital space and the digital tools. So I guess it comes back in a way to the first point I made about you need to have the traditional infrastructure in place to fully be able to take advantage of the digital opportunities that the next few years will have to offer.
Thank you, Nick. And that's also connected to what does the future look like and what is needed, digital infrastructure. So a very important point. Thank you for all of these questions. Keep them coming. And please feel free to raise your hand as well if you would like to ask your question rather than putting it in the chat box. I think it's a comment from Lydia. Data security was mentioned as by Nick. Cybersecurity becomes one of the critical areas when it comes to the introduction of smart governance. Cyber attacks happen to both private and public sectors. This calls for stronger cybersecurity so that data of citizens is not compromised. Yes, absolutely. The dangers of lack of proper infrastructures as well to handle the negative consequences of digital transformations, digital disruptions as well, is not one party alone. It's multiple stakeholders that can get affected, and this requires a very all-encompassing a way of looking at the topic. Thank you for that. Lydia, feel free to jump in the conversation if you would like to add to your opinion piece or anything else.
Yeah, I was also going to add that with regards to... Oh, wait, Lydia, were you chiming in? Go ahead.
I think you can go ahead.
Okay, I was going to say that one of the places where Africa needs to put a very strong foot forward. A few years ago, I was part of a commission on Facebook before it became Meta, and the European Union had the strongest government responses in how to deal with things like not just cyber attacks, but nude images online, use of children's images online, et cetera, right? And even now, we've seen a very strong response from European countries regarding Twitter's Grok, right, which has been very problematic in the last few months. And that's somewhere where over the years, I've seen that African countries are sort of behind in coming up with their own digital policy. What is acceptable to the country? How do they respond to what Grok is doing, right? And in fact, a lot of the trends that started a few weeks ago where Grok was being used to address people, a lot of those were Africa-based accounts, from what I could see, at least the ones that I was seeing, were a lot of Africa-based accounts. And it's like, well, but I didn't see from the AU or from SADC or from ECOWAS or any group any strong response of how they are going to engage with Twitter, with X on those matters going forward. Because it is critical that all of these regional bodies come up with their own response that is suitable to their cultural norms, their beliefs, their forms of governance, their citizens' preferences. And so that's somewhere where I think it's actually cross-cutting, where it doesn't have to be divided between the ruling party and the opposition. I think that's a place where most people can agree that there is need for strong policy, and that the strong policy can be put together across partisan lines. Yeah.
And thank you, Chipo, for that insight as well, and for the input about if we are talking about adaptation and adjustments as well, we have to be mindful of cultural context as well and local implications, which it's perhaps not one size fits all, and we really need to understand particular regional context, particular national context, even within the national context as well. What are the multifaceted aspects of cultures? So yes, we are having these discussions about digital transformations and so on. There are discussions happening, and there are going to be discussions happening and new ideas emerging. And again, it's not only political, I've addressed that, there are other dimensions as well. And the adjustments need to be mindful of cultural context. I really like that you have brought in this idea. And anyone else reflecting on the topic would like to, sorry, that was by mistake, would like to jump in the conversation?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit on, especially on Chipper's point, and also to extend that with technology and the advancements in AI and deepfakes. Of course, the advantage is that with more and more quality data, we may see improvements in evidence-informed policymaking. That policymakers who are savvy about these can actually build on quality data that they can use to make decisions and make it more efficiently. And so you can see the benefits of that coming if we do leverage technology and the issues about artificial intelligence in making policy decisions. But I think for Africa, the risk is the quality of data. Because if you look at all these AI models, a lot of them speak like American. They provide American content. It's almost, if you're talking to any AI model, it's just an American talking to you. The question is, how does data from the African continent become relevant for training some of these AI models? And I think this is where governments on the continent and the African Union and regional economic communities would need to be mindful of. So, in addition to coming up with the African voice on some of these issues that Chipo has mentioned, how do we take advantage and begin to build the data infrastructure that is needed to provide and to train these AI models in ways that is context relevant? That if we want to have a digital minister of finance, that digital minister is able to really make decisions based on data that is context relevant and not driven by another context, whether it's Europe or the US. And so I do think if this is a moment to take advantage of that and make sure that African data sources are of good quality that can be used to train this model. Otherwise, they train or leave the station before us, and then we'll try to play catch up. And that catch up can be difficult because people already start making decisions building on what AI is able to provide. And if it is not being provided with data from the African context, I think that is where we'll miss the train. So my hope, of course, from us at Afrobarometer, we do contribute a lot of data in this space, which can be useful for that. But I think we need a lot more than what we are able to provide from the citizen perspective.
Another excellent input as well on the equality of data and not overlooking African context when we are building that data infrastructure. And yes, if it is already happening elsewhere, it doesn't mean copy and paste into local context. It's also bringing in the African context. And I agree as well, existing data sources such as Afrobarometer and others, you guys play a really key role, and you need your work needs to be sustained and survive, and it needs to be informing existing discussions that we are having around the topic. Absolutely. And Yep, Imamdin, if you have questions or in case I've missed any of the key dots that we needed to connect. Yeah.
I think something we haven't talked about, and I was not thinking about this, but last week I was listening to the former disability advisor to the State Department in the US. And someone asked her what she thought, how technology could benefit our communities where people have different disabilities. And she pointed out that a lot of the technology that we use, be it Siri or Alexa or texting, right? Most of this came out of the disability communities. And there is an opportunity, especially in Africa, where people with disabilities have been left behind in education, in voting, and other forms of participation, especially in the economy, where technology could be harnessed to bring more access to communities with disabilities. I went to a high school that had students who were both blind and seeing students, and I can totally see how more access to digital tools would have made it easier for my classmates to read, right? They wouldn't have needed somebody else to read to them for the books that were not already in Braille. They wouldn't have needed me to read to them or to, they just so many ways that technology can be used on the continent to completely change lives for people with different disabilities. Something else that I often see in African elections is that we have a lot of assisted voters. And when you ask, who are these assisted voters? Why are these people being assisted to vote? Especially in Zimbabwe, where the literacy rate is pretty high. The response has often been, well, these are people who have different disabilities, so we needed to assist them to vote. And I think that could be improved greatly, right, with different forms of technology, because there is no reason why a lot of adults are having somebody else put a vote for them when that could just be done using technology in a way that brings access and equality for people within the disability communities.
Absolutely. Not to be we are coming up with another facet of a conversation as well, not to overlook another dimension to add and to continue adding that we should not overlook. Yes, Imamdin, I cut you earlier.
Yeah, I was trying to kind of, let's say, to make a bit of a protocol of the different discussion. And I tried to put them together on a few slides. So maybe if you allow me to share the screen, so I would like just to share my thoughts on what we have heard so far. Thank you very much, first of all, to all the different discussions and inputs, and also to you, Adila, for summarizing the 3 opinion pieces at the beginning. But kind of an image that came to my mind at the beginning was a bit a typical figure we've probably already have seen about what actually are the pillars of democracy. And then we often see that it's the legislature, it's executive, it's judiciary, as well as the press. And throughout the opinion pieces, but also the discussions we had, we see, well, they are all of these pillars are kind of addressed and disrupted by digitalization. We had these different discussions. So, for example, when we think about legislature as the representation of the people, it's an opportunity to create mass movement. So, in a way, it can strengthen this particular pillar, which is relevant for democracy, but it can have also another side effect. It can overrule, as Joseph was saying, just one singular influencer can overrule the role of political parties and can at the same time be also a threat. When you think about the executive and the responsible of how the bureaucracy worked as well, it can be a chance on the one hand side to improve e-governance tools. But then on the other hand, it's an opportunity, particularly for autocratic states, to collect data and observe the public. So that can be the side effect. In judiciary, so we heard about the opinion piece, the rule of law, which is relevant. So that then it comes exactly how are data protected. So is this done? There is a need to establish rule of law on this matter, and it can be ignored also and misused. And finally, the press, as we have also heard in the first opinion piece, has a critical role. Fake news can be spreaded more or less, but also less kind of censored information can be spread. So it's a balance. That's the word we heard, which addressed all of this pillar. And then we have heard about this issue of digital infrastructure, digital literacy, kind of the fundament that needs to play also here, whether actually digitalization can play in positively or negatively. So that's part of kind of this house. But then I also thought about particularly some of the comments came in, well, it's also internationally related. There are also outside players that can shape and probably also have interest to shape this house so far. There can be international tech firms with their private interest, but then there is also the chance of cyber attacks. So we're particularly thinking of countries, more authoritarian countries, which would like to foster also kind of more authoritarian mindsets, which kind of can shape these balances in which direction it may go, and whether some of these pillars can be strengthened or can be weakened. And then there was this discussion about kind of what are then the African solutions. We can't just be copied what is done elsewhere, what is done in Europe, what is done in Northern America or Australia, whatever. So there need to be African solutions. There should be thought about what are the institutions, the traditional institutions that are particular for Africa. So it's on the one hand side, a chance to strengthen this African agency. There's this recent term that came up of post-independence. So it's a chance to post-independence, but it can be also a threat when we think about this global perspective of other players kind of trying to also have their say and kind of gain partnerships or allies with particular African governments. So that's, of course, not a summary of all the discussions, but it's more reflecting how I thought about it. If you see that, first of all, do you share that? And if you share some of those perspectives, what do you think, where to start first? What if we have a goal towards democratization and see, we can't neglect digitalization that's affecting our societies today. Where to start working on it? Which pillars should be looked first at it, or is it set up the digital infrastructure, a particular pillar we see here, or another one, and how does it relate to the whole global perspective? Anybody among the panels who have some thoughts about that, or?
Yeah, I like the way you put this diagram here with the pillars. I would have thought that the pillar on press would have expanded to include civil society more broadly, because civil society is a big player in this space. But of course, the private sector as well. So a more comprehensive pillar that incorporates the press, the civil society more broadly, as well as, and of course, but where to start, I think the world is at a place where there's really, you can't have these come in chronological order again. You've got to tackle things almost concurrently, because building the technology infrastructure to be able to anchor some of these, issues that we're discussing here has to go hand in hand with everything else, because technology is advancing so quickly that if you want to do this in sequential terms, you may miss out, in many ways.
Thank you. How about the others? Do you see that similarly, or how do you see that?
I mean, I think What's interesting is that in a lot of countries, right, it's not really always been government driving progress, right? It's often been private tech companies. I mean, Safaricom in Kenya has a government stakeholder, or had a government stakeholder, but a lot of the innovation was, market driven. And, there's good things about that. It can make up for poor governance and lack of government engagement. But of course, we know that the market has to make a profit and isn't necessarily as concerned about some of those marginalized citizens that we were talking about. So I think there's two areas where governments, if we're talking about kind of what governments can do, need to play a role. One is in terms of, making sure that citizens' data is protected well, and making sure that tech companies respect the rules of the country. And the second is, making sure that companies that are making an awful lot of money out of these services also do so in a way that increases access to them for people from whom, who are less affordable and less profitable from the point of view of the business. I think, to be fair to African governments, this is something not very many governments are doing very well. Right? If you look at the general response to what is happening on Twitter, what Chipo talked about, we have very little effective regulation of social media or of tech companies, even in Western states. The European Union has done more. The UK is now talking about disciplining Twitter and having stronger, or X, and having stronger regulations. But in general, right, this is an area where I think governments have really struggled to understand what to do, partly because a lot of the challenges are created beyond their borders and because the companies we're talking about are headquartered beyond their borders. So the sorts of questions we're talking about, whether it's regulating Twitter or Facebook, whether it's the way they provide access to data, or whether it's the disinformation that they allow on their platforms, those are big global challenges that I think, we have to be clear that very few countries have found good solutions to. So in a sense, there's not an African problem here. It's a global problem, and we're looking at the African manifestation of that. I do think one of the challenges is that we're talking about, especially a set of governments that often are in moments of economic crisis right now. We have debt crises in many countries in Africa. We have countries like Ghana and Zambia going bankrupt. We have countries like Kenya that are not far away from going bankrupt. That financial crisis means that governments are in a weak position to negotiate with multinational companies and people who are bringing in investment. So in a sense, that's also, a challenge that we have to recognize here. And we also know that, in the last few years, African governments have done well on some areas in terms of coming together. For example, if we think about at least the agreement on the free trade area, but haven't always really been able to implement that. For example, when William Ruto came to power in Kenya, he talked a lot about not sending 24, 30 African leaders to conferences, but sending one person who can speak with the continent's voice. But that, of course, hasn't happened because no one could agree who that one person would be. And so, I think one of the big challenges is that if Africa is going to rewrite some of the terms of engagement for the sort of international tech firms and the cyber attacks and so on, one thing that would be really useful would be a coordinated, combined voice and approach that would enable the continent to work with more financial muscle. But unfortunately, we don't see that. In fact, if we look at West Africa and what has happened in terms of, the creation of the alliance and the states leaving ECOWAS, we actually see a more fragmented picture and less unity and less coherence around key goals. So, I think there are some things that could be done. I do think, this is a useful way of thinking about it. But I think some of these challenges are really sort of fundamental, and they go beyond the African continent to some of the key governance challenges that states around the world face today.
Yeah, and Nick is absolutely right. When many years ago, before Meta decided to have their Africa office, their entire Africa team had 5 people. And then Twitter, 4 years ago, they opened, before Jack left Twitter, they opened their first headquarters in Ghana. And then shortly after Elon came in, that was closed. And I was trying to look up online because I hadn't thought about it in a while. So they reduced the staff that was there. And I guess they kept some presence, but truly there is really nobody. And part of it is that these companies don't see a connection between their profits and their presence on the African continent. Similarly, I think Google has one major office on the continent in Ghana. I don't know how big it is. So we are talking about something that is produced by companies that are not domiciled and don't really have a footprint on the African continent. They just don't have a footprint. And so many of these issues, these discussions that we're having today, they should be somebody from these companies who would have been here, right? Telling us, okay, so these are the policies that we've put in place on the continent. These are the investments that we're making. Strive Masiwa and I think a bunch of other billionaires are looking to build an AI farm or something or rather on the continent. But I feel like they are going 10 steps before more than what do we really need an AI farm on or whatever it's being called on the continent, or do we first need to train people on how to use AI? We need to think about, I just read The Empire of AI and somebody was mentioning that a lot of the AI language is American centric. But what's interesting from reading The Empire of AI and other books that are coming out is that most of that labor of building these responses, right, these chatbots, all of it is happening in Africa, in Kenya in particular. So it's Africa generated in some ways, and yet it's not Africa reflective. So I would say that graph, what's missing is a recognition that the people in control are not in Africa. The people that produce this technology, that run this technology, that fund this technology are not on the continent. So even our governments, how much access do they have to the CEO of Google? I don't even know if the CEO of Google has done an Africa tour, quote unquote, an Africa tour, where they've gone to different countries to have conversations with African leaders, African civil society, African, I guess now influencers. That's a whole job. If they've done any of that, I've seen there's a streamer. I don't watch streams, but I understand there's a young streamer who's been going across the African continent and getting people excited, engaged, and now I'm hearing that African governments are thinking of how to create jobs for streamers and influencers. And I'm like, okay, what are we doing? Who's the streamer? What does that look like? Where does the revenue come from? So there is a lot that's happening, but I think the owners of the technology are just not present on the continent.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree. That's what I try to also illustrate it in the illustration. But that needs to be definitely emphasized. We have a really interesting comment also by Monty McMurtry. If you want to raise it, otherwise I will read it.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Greetings from Kinshasa, where the natives are restless. Listening to all what you're saying, it's crucially important. However, based on my limited knowledge, and the more I know, the less I understand, what is fundamental is to have a citizenry engaged, alert, and willing to speak up truth to power to governance. It is not easy because in terms of Africa, what I've witnessed, and I'm sure others are aware, is that there tends to be longevity in terms of governance, elite control. They are unwilling or unable to give up power for reasons of personal monetary privilege and personal security. Somewhat analogous to what's happening in the States with the mob boss Trump presenting as POTUS and the Trump crime family and holding on to what progressives. So distilled, in terms of what you're saying, is that you want to engage the citizen, or citizens need to be engaged, whether via education, they need to be empowered. Easier said than done. And yes, it's fraught. And what you are advancing is absolutely important, because the issue is not the intelligence or the intellectual horsepower of the African citizen. The limitation is that they have not been empowered via the tools or the fundamentals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. From our panelists, any reaction to that?
Well, Monday, I think you have a point, but of course, as we discussed earlier on with technology, there's an opportunity for citizens to get empowered. And we've seen that happen severally across the continent, where mobilization has become easier and citizens are able to organize in ways that can put pressure on governments. Of course, governments in power, and especially in places where elections are fairly fair, free and fair, it can be a very strong force when it comes to mobilization and the ease of mobilization with these technology tools and platforms. And so if governments who are elected and they know that elections matter and they are they can make a difference. When citizens can mobilize in these ways, it does provide some kind of threat to their power, and it can create some kind of accountability mechanism for citizens. And so in some ways, we can see the empowering role of technology. But of course, the downside that we all discussed here is it also empowers the state, and the state can also use it as a source of control. So, whether the net effect will be in favor of citizens or the states is the question that we have to deal with. And of course, that is where the private sector comes in, as to where the private sector lies, because as if accountability and government responsiveness is something that private sector would see as a value for their businesses, I think it can be a useful way to see the synergies between citizens and private sector acting as accountability mechanism for ensuring that governments are responsive to citizens. Otherwise, I think we can't always tell where the net effect will be, and this will vary by country anyway.
And I think that DRC is a good example of a place where the citizenry has been interested and has been engaged, but the government is using these tools. I don't have the data on me anymore, but at one point we counted that is it 2024 where they had shut down the internet for almost 200 days. So even if the citizens are engaged, but where the problem is that sometimes the government just sees the internet as a threat. I'm thinking about the first long shutdown in Ethiopia, where then the government was surprised that there was no banking happening, right? They're like, and then people are saying, well, you shut the internet. In your mind, you were shutting down just political conversation. But what you've done is this: people can't book flights. The airport is not functioning. The hospitals are not functioning. Schools are not functioning. So you were so concerned about political engagement that what you've done is that you've completely decimated the financial sectors, because banking, everything else happens online. And we can't do that because when you shut down the internet, it's not selective, right? And that's when we started to see some of these partial shutdowns that would target just a website or this or that. But the DRC, it's these blanket shutdowns, and you're thinking you're one of the major oil producers in the world. How is any commerce going to happen when you do these shutdowns? Because you're so concerned about the politics that you're not thinking about the economics of it, the education, the healthcare, all of these other things that get impacted when you do that.
And we have the example of Mauritius when 2024, just 10 days before the general elections, the previous government prime minister decided to ban social media, okay, just one day, and it affected small businesses, everyone who needed access to their internet banking to do small transactions at the supermarket and so on. So just because of general elections happening, and they were using it as a political tool in order to suppress the other political parties and allegedly to stop spread of propaganda. Just one day, and how much it impacted on the Mauritian economy and small businesses in particular. So yeah, that's one example to add to the list. On that note, I believe that brings us to the conclusion of our webinar series for 2025. Yes, it was supposed to happen in December, but we pushed it to January. And it's the closing panel conversation that we've had. We would like to thank wholeheartedly each of our author of opinion pieces. And to each of our panelists as well. You have acted as discussant to provide feedback, and also today to have this conversation with us. And yes, we don't like to leave it to a webinar discussion alone. We would contact our authors and panelists as well in due course. And we would like to get something concrete out of it. We don't have a specific idea. It's more abstract that we have in mind. But definitely this discussion that we have, it's not just for recording to put on our channel, but we would like to have something concrete out of it. We will reflect about that and email you. And thank you to our new followers as well. We have some of our loyal attendees and others who are joining us for the first time. We really appreciate it. Please keep updated with our work on our social media pages. Thank you very much. Imamdin, last words to you.
Yeah, I just can connect to your words. Thank you very much to all the authors. I saw, meanwhile, also Lydia started to attend today's webinar, and Valentina, both authors from 2 opinion pieces of last year. Thank you very much to the panelists. I think that was a really interesting conversation. I learned a lot. New questions came up, but I think that's always really good. Particularly also and a lot of really good comments, interactive comments. I think the last comment also made me think a lot. Also, it made me think about the concept of civicness, that for instance also Putnik came up of what is the role of the people, and the willingness to work for the for the society. Is it there? What influences it has? What shapes it? So I think these are critical questions. As it mentioned, it doesn't only concern the African continent, it concerns all over, but there might be some particularities that are special to the African context about ownership of new technologies and so on, particular traditions to the African context that raise further questions, and I think that's important to address them. So thank you very much again to all who participated here. So that was really a big round, authors, panelists, and participant attendees. Thank you very much, and we look forward to reconnect this year, next year. Hopefully be connected via our channels, LinkedIn, X, Instagram, and through our homepage, www.casp.org. Thank you very much, and have a nice day, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.